Hey everybody, it's Miss Miranda and I'm here to talk about the second part of decimals. This week we're going to be talking about adding fractional parts in tenths and 100ths, and that's fractional parts written as a fraction or as a decimal or interchangeably. And we're also going to be talking about comparing and ordering decimals. These are skills that we've learned about with fractions. We're going to relate that now to decimals, and remember that both of these skills with fractions are very difficult to do when the denominators are different. When you have different denominators, you're working with different size pieces, and it's hard to add a different number of different size pieces, and it's very difficult to compare them when you're talking about a different number of different size pieces. So the solution to that is making sure that you're using a common denominator, and we're going to talk about how we do that with fractions and also with decimals, especially when the denominator is understood and not explicitly written. So let's take a look at this first one here. Most students are going to look at this and say, oh, this is easy. We know from fractions all we do is add the numerators and ignore the denominators. We don't change the denominators. We don't do anything to the denominators. That's true when the denominators are the same, but when they're not, you cannot add these amounts. And what most students want to do is just do 7 plus 23 and call that 30. 30 what? Is it 30 tenths or is it 30 hundredths? That's the problem. So how do you make a common denominator? Well, we learned last week about equivalent fractions. So this one is already in 100ths. I can turn this one into 100ths pretty easily. So to turn 7 tenths into 7 hundredths, that's an equivalent fraction multiplying 10 times as many pieces. So we can think of 7 tenths as 70 hundredths and then add that with 23 hundredths. And now we're following the same rules that we've used before. So 70 plus 23, that's 93 hundredths. All right, we could also turn those into decimals as well. So if I want to do 70 hundredths, I can do that. And then what we're teaching students to do with decimals, what's so nice about them is that they don't actually have a denominator written. It makes it very easy to use place value instead. So when we line it up, making sure you always have our hundredths lined up with hundredths and our tenths lined up with tenths, it makes it easy to add. That's 3 in the hundredths, 9, 93 hundredths. So 93 hundredths is a fraction or as a decimal. If you want to line it up, you don't really have to change the common denominator here, as long as you want to make sure that your 23 hundredths ends up with your tenths lined up in the same spot. If you want to do it that way, that negates the necessity to have common denominators. But for our purposes, this looks a whole lot better to students. They like it when things line up, and then when we have common denominators, we like that as well. All right, here's one presented to us with decimals. Again, especially without the written denominator, students will see this and want to do 35 plus 4 and make that 39 hundredths. This is 35 hundredths. Okay, this needs a common denominator. This is in the tenths. So I want to make this into hundredths. So we learned with equivalent decimals that 4 tenths is the same as 40 hundredths, so I could write that as a decimal. I could just add an extra 0 out there and make that 35 hundredths plus 40 hundredths. Okay, again, with decimals, we want to get in a habit of lining those up vertically, especially because sometimes we're going to get more than 2 of these. We might get 3 or 4 or 5. It makes it a whole lot easier to add when you have it lined up. Okay, tenths lined up with tenths, hundredths lined up with hundredths, 75 hundredths. 35 plus 40 is 75. Which makes a whole lot more sense than 35 plus 4. All right, here's another one, back to fractions. We're going to turn this into 6 tenths is 60 hundredths plus 52 hundredths. Okay, I have this one because it goes over the whole. So this is 60 plus 52 is 112 hundredths. So we write that as 1 and 12 hundredths, or 1 and 12 out of 100. And we could have also written this, again, a whole lot easier to line it up as decimals and make it 60 hundredths plus 52 hundredths. Show my regrouping over the whole, and the same thing. 1 whole and 12 hundredths, or 1, is not really a decimal point there, 1 and 12 hundredths. Okay, so basically we want students to understand that decimals are a much more efficient strategy rather than having to write out the fractions with the denominators, add things, kind of almost mental math in my head when it's horizontally, or rewrite it vertically. Decimals are quicker and a lot easier if you make sure you line everything up and you remember to have that hundredths lined up over here, that there is that this value here is tenths, because when you just look at it, kids are just going to see that as a whole number value like 6, and it's not. 6 means 60. We want them to have that there. All right, and then here's another example of one that's got one decimal and one that has a fraction. So if one has a decimal and one has a fraction, I just got done saying that decimals are much more efficient. So let's change this one into 47 hundredths. This is in tenths. Again, I want common denominators, so this one's in hundredths. I want this to be in hundredths also. That means I need another place out there. So my equivalent decimals tell me 3/10 is the same as 30 hundredths. I can line that up. Okay, and then add, you get 77 hundredths. Okay, these are also pretty easy to do mental math because these are always going to be in multiples of 10, and usually students can count those on pretty simply. All right, here's one more example. This is a little bit of algebra to it. So 4/10 plus some amount equals 63 hundredths. We're working backwards here and use subtraction to find this answer, but it's not 63 minus 4. This 4/10 needs to become 40 hundredths. So 40 hundredths plus some amount is 63 hundredths. Okay, so I can skip count or count up. So 40, 50, 60, and 3 more. So make that 23 hundredths. If you want to check that with decimals, just rewrite this as 63 hundredths minus 40 hundredths. And I have 23 hundredths as a decimal. And if it's a multiple choice, sometimes you might get a fraction problem and your answer choices is a decimal, so it's good practice to have an understanding of those interchangeably. All right, next we're going to look at comparing and ordering and greater than, less than, and equal. So same principle, same idea, is that if you don't have a common denominator, students are going to look at those decimals, which are really numerators, and they're going to think about them as whole number values. And they're going to say 35 is bigger than 5. 35 is bigger than 5, but this is 35 hundredths. This is only 5/10. So you can rewrite that as 35 hundredths. Rewrite this as 5/10. Remembering these need to have common denominators. So this one's in hundredths. This is only in tenths. We make that into 50 hundredths. Or, again, decimals, much more efficient. 35 hundredths. I want this to have a common denominator. All I have to do is add a 0 out there. These are my equivalent decimals. And 50 is greater than 35. So they have to train themselves not to look at this as 5, but look at it as 50. Okay, again, 2 looks smaller than 4, but this 2 doesn't mean 2. This 2 is 2/10, which is the same as 20 hundredths. 20 hundredths is greater than 4 hundredths. Also, if we wanted to line these up with place value, you can see they each have the same value in the wholes, but this has a greater tenths value. So this has a greater tenths value no matter what value is going to be over here. This is going to be largest, and that's just a place value rule we've learned since first grade. So 20 hundredths is bigger than 4 hundredths. All right, one's a fraction, one's a decimal. Make it into decimals because that's more efficient. 52 hundredths compared to 6/10. Okay, it's not 52 compared to 6, it's 52 compared to 60. 60 hundredths greater than 52 hundredths. All right, and then looking least to greatest, we're just going to have more numbers to look at here. Most students looking at this, if they didn't have a good decimal understanding, they were just looking at these numbers, they would say 3, then 6, then 9, then 24. That's why you want to make sure everything has a common denominator. If I have one that's, or 2 of them that are in hundredths, I want everything to be in hundredths. So this one needs to be changed to hundredths. So 3/10 is going to be 30 hundredths. 24 hundredths stays the same. 9 hundredths stays the same. And 6/10 is going to be 60 hundredths. Now I'm looking at these as numbers that are of the same, basically 2 digits from 1 to 99. So this is 30, 24, 9, and 60. Now they all have the same size pieces, the same denominator. It makes it a lot easier to compare them. So 9 hundredths is less than, next one would be 24 hundredths, which is less than, my original decimal is 3/10, so I'm going to use the original number they gave me, even though I'm using 30 hundredths to show my work there. And then the one that's greatest is 6/10. Okay, least to greatest. All right, here's another one too. All right, so these are in hundredths, 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 and this one's only in tenths, so I want to make sure that I'm making this into tenths. Another mistake students will get in the habit of is they'll look at what's behind the decimal exclusively and not realize that this has a whole number value here, so that's automatically, with one whole, going to be larger than anything else here. So I'll make this 8/10 into 80 hundredths. This is 1 14 hundredths, 63 hundredths, and 99 hundredths. Okay, a lot of times I'll see this 99, so that has to be the biggest. You know, the biggest less than a whole, but anything with a whole, doesn't matter what that decimal amount is after, it's going to automatically be largest. All right, so 63 hundredths is least. It's less than 80 hundredths, which was my original decimal 8/10. Then 99 hundredths, and the largest 1 14 hundredths. All right, so pretty easy stuff this week. It's all about making sure we're using a common denominator and using an equivalent decimal to get there. Once we make everything into the same size pieces, once we work everything out of hundredths, it makes it a whole lot easier. Kind of like with money. Money's always in hundredths. Just makes it a lot simpler. All right, thank you for watching, and we will test this week on Friday on decimals.